Ms. Progress, I see Ms. Hull on the screen. Are we moving to Ms. Hull's testimony?
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, that would be our preference.
Thank you. And I think I've already sworn you in, right, Ms. Hull?
You have, yes.
Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Thank you. Board members, Ms. Hull will be testifying briefly on EDF's flowback proposal and
Hold on. I'm sorry, Ms. Paranos, you're
Yes.
breaking up. You might need to turn off your video.
Is that better?
Mm.
Yeah.
Speak again. I'm sorry.
Yeah. 1 second.
It's not better. I'm sorry.
Is it better now? I just turned off my Bluetooth. No.
Not really. No.
That's strange. Still not better. No.
No.
Strange. Let me restart, I guess.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's clear. Thank you.
Terrific, of course. So just Ms. Hull's testimonies have already been submitted, I believe. However, I don't think I introduced them all into evidence due to the objection. So at this point, she will be discussing in terms of her exhibit. It's Exhibit EE. And her testimony is, just put aside my page with all of her testimony written down on it. This is in her direct testimony. While I find it, if I could submit into evidence all of Ms. Hull's exhibits and testimony subject to the outstanding objection.
Thank you. Let me pause a moment in the event there are other objections. Not hearing anything. They're admitted. Thank you.
Terrific. Ms. Hull, did you do a cost effectiveness analysis of the costs and emission reductions that EDF anticipates would accrue if the board adopted our well completion proposal?
Yes, we did.
And could you please just explain that analysis to the board?
Sure thing. So EDF used the CDPHE cost benefit analysis for revisions to Regulation 7 from September 2020 to evaluate cost and cost effectiveness associated with the emissions control requirements for flowback vessels and associated equipment. And that's Exhibit EE. The CDPHE requirement.
Ms. Hull, I'm
Yes.
sorry to interrupt you. I think
Slow
because
down.
you're reading, you're speaking very fast.
The CDPHE requirements include using vapor-tight flowback tanks and conducting periodic visual inspections of the flowback tanks and of the associated equipment. The analysis found that these requirements could be implemented at a cost of $53.79 per ton reduced during the 3-year average for the number of completions over 15 years. And that was per ton of methane. So we used the statewide average of methane to VOC ratio, as we did for other analytics, for completion specifically. And we found that this comes to $259.48 per ton of VOC reduced. As such, EDF finds that these measures are a cost-effective means of mitigating flowback emissions.
Thank you, Ms. Hull. And that concludes the summary of Ms. Hull's testimony on this particular issue. She is available for cross-examination.
Thank you very much, Ms. Paranos and Ms. Hull. If you're a party with questions, please turn on your screen. Not seeing anyone. I will turn to the board for their questions. In the event you're an attendee on the platform, please reach out through chat with any questions. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Hall. And so I don't have any questions at this time.
Thank you. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis.
Thank you. I don't have any questions at this time either.
All right. Member Cates.
No questions here. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Bitzer.
No questions. Thank you.
All right. Member Garcia.
No questions, thank you.
And Member Honker.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Hull, for your testimony, and thank you, Ms. Paranos.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Let's see. Ms. Katz or anyone else really at this point? Does it make sense to go back to Mr. Smitherman?
Madam Hearing Officer, it seemed is Mr. Schreiber going to appear because he was speaking to the flowback issues, and maybe we should hear the environmental case, then have industry respond, and then the department.
Thank you. That's I see a lot of nodding. Ms. Fox?
I was going to suggest to Madam Hearing Officer, thank you, Mr. Heiser. Mr. Schreiber is on the panelist screen, and well, there he is.
There he is. Mr. Schreiber, would you spell your name for the record, please? Can't hear you.
How about now?
Very low.
We can hear you at the end, so speak a little.
I never speak a little, Ms. Fox, as you well know, but I'm usually well.
Too well. Okay.
Is that any better, madam?
That's much better. Thank you, Mr. Schreiber.
Okay.
Would you spell your name for the record, please?
Yes, it's Don, D-O-N, last name Schreiber, S-C-H-R-E-I, B like in boy, E-R.
Thank you, and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. Please state your name.
Don Schreiber.
What is your educational background?
I have a bachelor's degree in science from the University of New Mexico.
And what is your work experience, Mr. Schreiber?
Well, for 22 years, from 1976 to 1998, I owned Schreiber Insurance Agency in Farmington. We provided risk management services for the oil and gas industry, including oil and gas producers, service contractors, drillers, geologists. We investigated, evaluated, and adjusted claims throughout the San Juan Basin, including inspecting rigs for drilling, completion, and workover.
Do you have any educational certificates related to the oil and gas industry?
Yes, to learn about safety in drilling and production operations, I received an elementary drilling certificate that included instruction in well completions from the University of Texas Permian Basin in Odessa.
What activities have you been engaged in since your retirement in 1998?
Well, I retired from my business, and then my wife and I started and operate now a ranch, the Devil Springs Ranch in northwest Rio Arriba County, in the area of Governador, an old ranching community here. Our objective was to create a scalable model for sustainable agriculture using non-traditional ranching practices. Today, we lease our deeded and permit land for cattle operations when range conditions permit.
Is Clean Air Advocates Exhibit 9 an accurate copy of your resume?
Yes, it is.
And you submitted direct testimony on behalf of Clean Air Advocates, which is Exhibit 10 for the board's information. Mr. Schreiber, is that testimony accurate to the best of your knowledge?
Yes, it is.
Are there oil and gas wells on and around your ranch in Rio Arriba County?
Yes, there are approximately 122 gas wells on and around our ranch. 33 of those wells are within a mile of our home.
After you purchased the ranch, what did you begin to learn about the oil and gas operations there?
Well, in the early 2000s, drilling pressures in the area had really increased, and ConocoPhillips leased the subsurface rights to our land and wanted to drill 44 new wells on and around a ranch. We were concerned about the impacts to our land and our health, including emissions from well completions, as well as surface disturbance and spills.
Hold on 1 second there. I'm going to ask the hearing officer for screen sharing authority, please. And then please continue, Mr. Schreiber.
Ready? Okay. Well completion and recompletions were a particular concern to us because well completions, which is the process of taking a drilled well to a producing one, were still being essentially done in the same manner they had been done in the San Juan Basin for the last 50 years. So before production, flowback gases, water, and debris were pushed to the surface. The solid wastes were discharged into an earthen pit, and gases were vented or burned from the wellhead via a line called a bluey line.
Here, let me bring that up. I just messed up here. Hold on 1 second. Hold on. I just really messed. Okay. My apologies. There we go.
So here's a photo of a bluey line in operation in 1958 here in the San Juan Basin, where I grew up. And then if we have the next slide, these are photos of bluey line completions on and around our ranch in 2005 and 6.
What impacts did you see from well completions?
Well, the environmental impacts of bluey line completions are obvious. Hear it, see it, smell it. These impacts came into sharp focus one time when our ranch was covered in black snowflakes that came from a bluey line completion about 1.25 miles to the northeast of our home.
What actions did you take in response to these impacts from completions?
Well, moving away from bluey line completions and avoiding the harmful and toxic waste from the completions was a priority as we began this 44 well drilling program with ConocoPhillips in 2008. Our concerns led us to the discovery that gas capture completions or reduced emission completions could help prevent the harmful emissions that we were worried about, and we found that were already being used in the San Juan Basin.
What are EPA reduced emissions completions?
Well, according to EPA, reduced emissions completions, and I'm going to read this, quote, is a term used to describe an alternate practice that captures gas produced during well completions and well workovers following hydraulic fracturing. instead of venting or flaring those emissions. These emissions include volatile organic compounds, ozone precursors, methane, I mean, all of that, toxic air pollutants, including things like benzene.
How did you learn about reduced emissions completions?
Actually, an oil company introduced us to the equipment. Devon Energy Corporation introduced us to the equipment, and then that same equipment was brought to our ranch and then used by ConocoPhillips between 2008 and 2012, or versions of that equipment. Before that, we didn't know about gas capture technology, but we did learn it was in wide use. As a matter of fact, NMOGA, the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, along with the EPA and the NMED, put on workshops for producers here in Farmington, both in 2006 and then again in 2012, promoting gas capture technology, reduced emissions completions. And
Are
we
those
have that I'm so sorry.
No, go
I
ahead.
was just going to say we have that in our exhibit 15. When and if that comes, we can look at it.
I can share that if you would like.
Let's just keep it handy, and we can go back.
And then we also have exhibit 14, correct, from one of those workshops.
Yes. Well, there are the Gas Star program in cooperation with the American Petroleum Institute, the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, and various environmental departments. There are many examples. We've chosen a few.
You said that you learned that RECs are a common practice.
Ms. Fox, I think I confused you, and I apologize. I wanted to say with regard to Exhibit 14 and Exhibit 15, that there is an example included in Exhibits 14 and 15 from a workshop that is of an operator, Weatherford in this case, that captured and sold 2 million cubic feet of gas recovered from only 3 gas capture completions, and that was nearby in the Durango, Colorado area. That amount of gas is enough to meet the natural gas needs of 28 households for a year.
And you had said that you had learned that RECs or reduced emission completions was a common practice within the San Juan Basin, correct?
Well, yes, and more broadly, we knew that Devon was using gas capture equipment, and as were many others, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, British Petroleum, to name a few. In fact, Devon described its use of gas capture or REC equipment as, quote, standard practice, end quote.
How did REC equipment come to be used at your ranch between 2008 and 2012?
Well, we worked with ConocoPhillips and BLM to develop a program for the 44 wells that were going to be drilled on us to reduce impacts to the land, air, and water, including impacts from well completions by the use of gas capture equipment. So between those years of 2008 and 2012, 22 of the 44 wells in the program were drilled and completed or recompleted, so that we visited those well sites many times to be sure that they were following the agreement, understanding that we had, which they were. And then we observed REC equipment on the locations and in use. And then in 2012, the price of natural gas declined and the drilling in that program stopped.
What happened after that?
Well, in 2017, Hillcore Energy Company bought out ConocoPhillips in the San Juan Basin. So in early 2018, Hillcorp first gave us notice that it would be recompleting a well on our federal grazing permit land. When we met with Hillcorp, we were shocked to learn that Hillcorp didn't necessarily commit to using REC equipment, and that they were claiming that Hillcorp didn't have any REC equipment, that they had no trained crews, and that perhaps formation pressures in the area were too low. However, my wife and I already knew that REC equipment was widely available and that there was a large pool of skilled oilfield workers in the San Juan Basin, and that further, we knew that formation pressures were adequate, or in the instance that they weren't, those formation pressures could be boosted so that REC equipment could be used.
What was your reaction to this news from Hillcorp?
Well, we believe that Hillcorp should honor the agreement we had with ConocoPhillips to conduct gas capture during completions and recompletions. And since 2012, emissions from hydraulically fractured natural gas wells for completions and recompletions were being regulated by the EPA under their Quad OA rule, later strengthened in the Quad OA rule.
What happened then?
Well, Hillcorp proceeded with recompletion of another well site, approximately 1.25 miles from our home, without even giving us the benefit of an on-site meeting. We learned that the well was to be fracked on March 7th, 2018, and when we arrived that day, we found out that the fracking operations were being concluded and that preparations for recompletion were in place with the flowback gases to be vented directly to the atmosphere, into the space where we live and work. Yes, we have, that's some blowout pictures. There we go. Okay, so this is the exact well, that March 8th date, so that Hillcorp went ahead with their recompletion with no REC equipment in place. And you can see, or we have, thank you, we have identified that no REC equipment was in place. So we can see that the flowback line goes directly into an open container called a flowback box. The fluids are, sorry, the solids and the liquids are no longer thrown on the ground as, or discharged onto the ground as they were in buoy line completions. Now they are captured in that box, you see, but the box is open at the top all the way, fully open, and all of the gases vent directly to the atmosphere. And that's the method that Hillcorp uses to this day.
What has happened more recently, Mr. Schreiber?
Well, Hillcorp divides the San Juan Basin into 5 operating areas. And in 2012, in February, we learned that 22 recompletions were to be done in our area alone. So since those recompletions took place back in 2018, we learned that Hillcorp, which has been identified as the worst methane polluter of oil and gas companies in the country, they went on to recomplete a well recently on us, about 1 mile from our ranch house last August, just a few months ago. So I observed that recompletion every day that was in process. And I can say with certainty that Hillcorp did not capture 1 molecule of methane or VOCs during that entire recompletion process.
Mr. Schreiber, you were appointed to Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham's Energy Transition Team in 2018, correct?
Yes, and I served on the Methane Advisory Panel sponsored by NMED and the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department. I also attended the signing of the governor's, one of her first executive orders, Order 2019-003, targeting climate change. That order acknowledged both the potency of methane as a greenhouse gas, and it also, for the very first time, assigned the oil and gas industry as the largest industrial source of methane and ozone precursor pollutions. The governor committed then to passing the strongest methane rules in the nation. To keep that commitment, the EIB must require control of emissions during completions and recompletions. New Mexico's rules should be at least as strong as Colorado's.
What do you mean by that, Mr. Schreiber?
Well, as been stated today in testimony last fall, the Colorado Air Quality Control Commission, Colorado's analog to the EIB, passed regulations on completions and recompletions that generally require, during completions and recompletions, all methane be captured, not vented or flared. Colorado's regulations actually go beyond the EPA's Quad O-A regulations in their regulation of recompletions and completions, and they require capture of emissions during the entire flowback process, as Mr. Alexander stated in his testimony. So I strongly support New Mexico adopting Colorado's approach, which would place New Mexico at the forefront of emissions control during completions and recompletions. This proposal to capture emissions during completions and recompletions is set forth in the joint proposed revised amendments from Clean Air Advocates, EDF from the Center for Civic Policy, and NAVA Education Fund, and is now supported by Oxy USA, a major operator in the state, and by the National Park Service as well.
Mr. Schreiber, do you have any closing thoughts for the EIB to consider?
Yes, failure to capture these emissions represents a gaping hole in New Mexico's regulation. That will plague my family and families like mine who work, live, and go to school close to oil and gas operations. Standing on my ranch, I can see Colorado, which is less than 25 miles away, to know that the same operators that are allowed to vent ozone precursors, methane, toxic pollutants from completions and recompletions here in New Mexico are prevented from doing so in Colorado is deeply troubling. These operators drill into the same formations, they vent the same pollutants into the same air sheds, and they threaten the same communities right here in the same region of the country. New Mexico, like our sister state, should adopt reduced emission completion requirements. These requirements are technically feasible, they reduce waste, and they protect our health and our environment, especially in rural communities like mine.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Schreiber. He now stands for cross-examination.
Thank you, Mr. Schreiber and Ms. Fox. If you're a party with questions, please turn on your screen. Mr. DeSalen, I see you.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. Can you hear me okay?
I'm very sorry, Mr. DeSalen. It sounds like you're coming through water. Perhaps if you turn off your video.
I'll get my snorkel. Is that better, Madam Hearing Officer?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Schreiber. Just for the record, my name is Charlie DeSalen. I'm an attorney with the New Mexico Environmental Law Center. And I just have one question for you regarding your the proposal for controlling emissions during completions and recompletions. Is it your understanding that the New Mexico Environmental Law Center also supports that proposal?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. That's all I have. Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you, Mr. DeSalen. If you are a party with a question of Mr. Schreiber, please turn on your camera. Not seeing anyone else. I'll turn now to the board for their questions. If you're an attendee on the platform with a question, please reach out through chat. Madam Chair?
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer, and thank you, Mr. Schreiber, for your testimony to provide us, in on the ground perspective. So I appreciate that. At this time, though, I don't have any questions.
Thank you. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis.
Yes, Mr. Schreiber, thank you for taking the time to talk with us and share your experience with us. I'm curious, were you able to get resolution on the issues that you have on your ranch?
No, ma'am. Previously, we did, but since 2018, no.
Oh, I'm very sorry to hear that. And I don't have any other questions, but again, thank you for sharing your experience with us.
Thank you. Member Kate?
No questions here, thank you.
Thank you. Member Bitzer?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Member Garcia?
No questions, thank you.
And Member Honker?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Any follow-up, Ms. Fox?
No, thank you, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Schreiber, for joining us. And thank
Yes,
you,
thank
Ms.
you.
Fox. All right. Does it make sense now to return to the department or to go to Mr. Smitherman? I'm not sure what other witnesses we'll be hearing from.
Might be good just to take temperature. I would think we'd want to hear from Mr. Smitherman before we go back to the department.
Yes, we agree with that.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Heiser.
Is there anybody else? Are we down just to Mr. Smitherman and then Ms. Keene and Ms. Palmer? You know?
Let me pause. Those are the only ones I know of, but let me pause for a moment. I did ask Pam to reach out to Ms. Witherspoon because I know she was on the platform yesterday. I wanted to invite her comment today, but I haven't heard back yet whether we'll be able to hear from her today. And she indicated she may put her comment in writing. So if she rejoins us, I will invite her to speak.
Madam Hearing Officer, I'm wondering if if Mr. Jano has any witnesses on this, since they were part of the, I believe they had supported that proposal, but.
It's a good question from Ms. Katz.
I think we were going to hear one more time from Mr. Holderman, weren't we? Let's see, Mr. Jano?
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, Mr. Holderman is going to speak. I apologize, I had stepped out for a second to find Mr. Holderman, but this is on with connection to the workover from, yes. He's prepared to speak on that briefly on Sir rebuttal. We could also do that. He has testimony in connection with the flowback proposal. We could do that at that time too.
Why don't we let if Mr. Holderman's available, why don't we let him cover all of his remaining topics in one fell swoop, and then we were going to do the same with Mr. Smitherman.
Great idea.
That would be great, and he's literally walking through the door. So we'll get him up here in 2 seconds.
Thank you, everyone. Whenever you're ready, Mr. Jano.
Do all of it. Madam Hearing Officer, I have Mr. Holderman with me. He is going to be addressing section 124 on well workovers. This is a SIR rebuttal point. So this is developed post testimony, so it is not one found in either Oxy Exhibit 2 or Oxy Rebuttal Exhibit 2. And then has comments on the proposal for flowback presented by EDF, CAA, CPP, and NAVA, which is at the new section 127. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Holderman.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Holderman, you remain under oath. And could you please summarize your SIR rebuttal testimony concerning well workovers?
Sure. Although not addressed in my direct or rebuttal testimony, after reviewing the supplement filed by EDF, Clean Air Advocates, and NAVA on September 19th, 2021, concerning the process for measuring the 1,000-foot distance for occupied areas, Oxy USA believes that the notification requirements in section 124E2 should be modified to be consistent with this clarification in the use of occupied areas. Specifically, the quarter-mile distance used in the provision should cover the distance from the latitude and longitude of wellheads to either the property line for schools, property line for outdoor venues and recreation areas, location of buildings or structure used as a place of residence, and or the location of commercial building. In addition, notification to residents should cover anyone in manufactured, mobile, or modular homes, except that any such manufactured, mobile, or modular homes intended for temporary occupancy or for business purposes should be excluded. These clarifications will help ensure more accurate evaluations and consistent application.
And Mr. Holderman, does that conclude your SIR rebuttal testimony?
It does.
On well workovers? Madam Hearing Officer, we can either present Mr. Holderman for cross-examination on this now or just run through the flowback proposal.
Please run through the flowback.
Sure. So, Mr. Holderman, could you please summarize your direct and rebuttal testimony on section 127, the flowback proposal?
Sure. As noted in my rebuttal testimony, Oxy USA supports the proposed requirements for flowback vessels and pre-production operations by EDF, Clean Air Advocates, and NAVAs with two important changes to the original proposal. First, Oxy USA removed the vapor tight reference because it could be read to exclude pressure relief systems, which are an essential safety feature for control systems. The general control language Oxy USA has proposed would not restrict pressure relief systems and is more consistent with safe operation. Second, Oxy USA has also proposed to require compliance for existing facilities beginning 1 year following the rule's effective date so that existing facilities have the time needed to ensure their required vessels and control devices are in place. Oxy USA understands that EDF, Clean Air Advocates, and NAVA have included both these changes in their rebuttal testimony, and we appreciate their agreement. I would also like to note that while this new section is workable for Oxy USA's New Mexico operations, with the modifications discussed, I can't say whether these are feasible for other operators in the state. I'm only speaking to Oxy USA's individual.
Madam Hearing Officer, with that, we would present Mr. Holderman for cross-examination on his SIR rebuttal to section 124, as well as his rebuttal testimony on 127.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holderman and Mr. Jano. If you're a party with a question of Mr. Holderman, please turn on your camera. I'm not seeing anyone. I'll turn now to the board. If you're an attendee with a question, please reach out through chat. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer, and thank you, Mr. Holderman. I don't have any questions at this point.
Thank you. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis.
I don't have any questions either. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Kate. I can see that he's on the platform. He may have stepped away. Member Bitzer.
No questions. Thank you.
Was that you, Member Cates?
Yes, no questions here. Thanks.
Thank you. Member Garcia.
No questions, thank you.
And Member Honker. No questions. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Holderman, for rejoining us. And thank you, Mr. Jano.
Thank you.
Shall we go to Mr. Smitherman?
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer. I believe he should be on the panel. And just to help everybody, we're going to be talking about the commence operation, which is one of the definitions that he had spoken to in his direct and rebuttal, but was in a section when he was not here. We'll talk about automatic tank measurement and then the flow back and associated definitions that we've been having with the environmental proposals today, sort of what he's going to be covering. I do not see him yet. Okay.
My video's on. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Good morning, Mr. Smitherman. Can you please state your name for the court reporter?
John R. Smitherman.
Thank you. And you've been previously sworn in this matter, is that correct?
Yes, I have.
And your rebuttal testimony is found in NMOGA Exhibit 41, is that correct?
That's correct.
There was a definition that you had found important to discuss, and that's the definition of commence operation. Could you explain your concern to the board about that definition? And did you have a slide that sort of shows this?
I do. Let me share my slides. I think that's the wrong slide. It's always a challenge. Give me just a moment, please. I think that's the correct slide deck.
Yes, this one talks about flow back.
Let me see if I can minimize this. Move it out of my way. Great. Thank you very much for that opportunity. I'm going to talk to you about the process of drilling a well, completing a well, and flowing back hydraulic fracture stimulations, not only as the industry perceives it, but also as the OCD rules now define and require operators to meet their new requirements under the recent waste rules that were worked on through the hearing in January and are now in place. I'm going to, NMED has included the phrase, but no later than the end of well completion operation in their definition of commencement of operation. I'm going to address that in detail in just a few minutes. Mr. Alexander has also suggested that the definition of flowback be added, and then suggest that vessels used for flowback, I think now may not be vapor tight. I see some movement there, but also with automatic tank gauging systems. To address those issues, I need to kind of start from the physical understanding of what goes on. I'll try to, as carefully as I can, define for you all of these phases, both in their physical reality and then how they relate to the OCD rules. This is a slide I used in the OCD hearing in January. Is it large enough? Can you see it? Perhaps could make it a little bigger.
Where would be better, Mr. Smitherman?
Is that helpful?
That is better, yes.
Too large. What I'm showing here today is a timeline where you see this blue bar at the top. Time actually starts here at the spud. This is basically the life of a well. So time begins here when the well is spudded and then moves across to the right until the well's end of life when it's plugged and abandoned. Obviously, this is not to scale. All of these drilling and completion operations take place within a couple of months at the longest usually, and the production operations could easily be 30 years or longer. So it's really more a conceptual process that I'll walk you through. This line here describes the physical things that are happening. This is the drilling operations section. This is the completion operation section, and then the production operations in this third section here. I'm going to skip this line here and move to the bottom, where I give a little more detail about what's in this period of time. This is when the well is drilled, casing strings are run and cemented, and in essence, it ends when the production casing has been set, cemented, and the wellhead installed. Then the completion operations begin. Some of those completion operations deal with running additional strings of pipe in the hole to prepare for the completion hydraulic stimulation process. There's some other things that have to happen before, in essence, you perforate your first stage, your first section or first area that you're going to hydraulically fracture. And by the way, this is typically, this is not anything really different for a conventional well, but it is more specific to an unconventional well that's a horizontal well with many frac stages. The first perforation occurs sometime during that completion process. Obviously not the very first, there's other things that have to happen before then. And then this is all the time frame that hydraulic fracture stages are pumped. Plugs are put in place for subsequent stages to be pumped. And until that process is finished, you could have 30 stages, you could have 50 stages or more. All of that process goes until you finished completing hydraulically stimulating all the stages that you intend to stimulate in this phase. At that point, the well is drilled out. These stage plugs that have been put in the well are drilled out, and those fluids that are used to drill them out, the debris from the frac plugs is brought to the surface. And at some point, you begin flowing the well back. And that's what we call initial flowback. And in this particular box here, I put that initial flowback that could have started before the end of this completion phase, but it typically does not. You typically finish your drill out and cleanly go from drill out to initial flowback. Now the flowback period is in two separate phases that are very clearly demarked in both the physical operations and the rules that govern them. The initial flowback on a well is when, let's talk about a well that is hydraulically fracked with a water-based fluid. That's easier to talk about to start with. Initial flowback begins with virtually all water. It takes a little while before the well starts giving up any of its hydrocarbons. It doesn't take long. I think very typically a few days. We used to look for a significant oil percentage within about 2 or 3 days, but certainly no less than 2 weeks. At some point in this initial flowback, the well, well, let me say it differently. All during this initial flowback, the well is flowing back, but it doesn't have the surface pressure and rate and gas rate to operate a separator. But as soon as the well's flowback fluids have enough gas and can hold enough back pressure on the well to operate a separator, at that moment, you move from initial flowback stage to separation flowback stage. And that's important relative to the OCD rules in place now. Separation flowback is then, the fluids are all run through a separator, and according to the OCD rules, at that point, all gases that come from the separator must be routed to sales. There is a provision for flaring during separation flowback if there's safety issues involved, or if the gas is not saleable due to contaminants. Separation flowback then, in essence, is like normal production. It's just through an initial separator on site, typically what we call a 4-phase separator. The first, those phases are gas, oil, water, and solids. So all during the separation flowback, all of those fluids except the solids are sent basically to the production facilities for sale in most cases. Separation flowback ends when that separation equipment is not needed and you can go straight to normal production operations. With an asterisk, the OCD requires that separation flowback end and normal operations begin no more than 30 days after the initial flowback starts. So it's a limited time that you have the ability to operate under that set of regulations. And then production operations are normal production operations. This is where the fluids from the well are going straight to your production facilities and are being handled normally. Made this a little too big here. So I've just talked about the fact that drilling operations end with casing set. EDF has suggested that drilling or drilled, a little unclear as to endpoint of drilling operations, but they also have.
Mr. Smitherman,
Yes.
you are getting progressively fainter and fainter as you're going along. So maybe you can move your phone to a point where it's closer to right in front of you.
I'm going to try to take a piece of equipment out of the process. Just give me a second. Is that any better?
It is.
I had an extension cord. Perhaps that was causing a problem. EDF also adds the concepts of drilling or drilled to be added to definitions, and drill out, which they say ends after the removal of all stage plugs and the initial wellbore cleanup. We believe that that suggested definition lacks clarity. For one thing, how is initial wellbore cleanup itself defined? So NMOGA recommends not accepting the EDF definitions of drilling or drill out. As I mentioned before, completion operations start with the first perforation and ends at the end of separation flowback with a limit of 30 days. That's from the OCD. Flowback, as I've said, consists of the initial flowback, which ends when it's technically feasible to operate a separator. And then separation flowback begins at that moment and lasts until normal production facilities are used with a limit of 30 days. So production operations begins at the end of separation flowback, but again, no later than 31 days after flowback. Now, this is related to the commencement of operations, and I'm going to go into some little detail about that. The current definition as proposed by the NMED of commencement of operations is very consistent with the OCD rules, except for their endpoint, where they say no later than the end of well completion operations. The problem with that is, and I think it probably is rare, but especially now with the waste rule in place, wells that do not have facilities that are completed or adequate gas takeaway are not allowed to produce and flare gas until they have adequate gas takeaway. And so there can be wells that are completed, fracked, flow back, and then shut in, awaiting the completion of facilities or completion of a gas takeaway, gas sales line. The inclusion of the term, but no later than the end of well completion operation, would have the effect in those circumstances of that operator having to do inspections, including LDAR and AVOs and other type of monitoring activities, basically on a facility that's idle if this was the very first well to go to that facility. And all we're recommending is we remove that term to simply begin the completion operation or the commencement of operations when production actually does begin as appropriate. EDF also offers a new definition of pre-production operations. This apparently includes drilling through some of the well, just the part drilling through the hydrocarbon bearing zones, and extending through fracturing, refracturing, drill out, and flow back. We believe that that's unnecessary and it's going to add confusion for at least the reason that refracturing can take place months or even years after the initial completion. We don't believe that this suggested definition adds any value, and we suggest that NMB reject that, or that the board reject that. So let's talk about flowback vessels. We've had a lot of conversation about those today. Some parties have recommended that vessels that receive flowback fluid from wells after completion be required to be vapor tight. I've heard some other terms, and have automatic tank gauging systems. This is not advisable for safety concerns. By the way, we expressed that at the OCC hearing in January, and the OCD staff expressed their same concerns. Let's talk about that a little bit. We heard some of the testimony earlier today about the safety issues and some of the steps that can be taken to mitigate against those issues. What I have also heard is, well, they're doing it in Colorado, and so far it's been, there's been no events, if you will. It's been event-free or incident-free. I always get a little skeptical when I hear someone talking about something being safe because it's been incident-free. And I'm going to give you a little story from my experience at my former company I worked for, Bopco, where we were flowing a well back. Let's start with a different one. We actually used a technique for intervening with wells called foam air. It basically takes water, a surfactant, and air. It creates a foam, a lot like shaving cream, quite frankly, and uses it to circulate a well. We had done it many times before without incident, until one day we did have an incident. We had a downhole explosion at around 700 feet from the surface. The shock wave from that explosion came to the surface, destroyed the wellhead, and killed a 21-year-old young man. We dove deeply into understanding what happened and discovered that that process, unless very, very well understood, is fundamentally unsafe. We didn't have incidents because for many, many times we simply got lucky. The stars didn't line up against us, and we had incident-free use of that technique until we didn't. It is possible to make that technique safe, but it takes a deep knowledge of the physics, deep knowledge of the risks, and careful planning. There's better ways to do it. In fact, I've just finished a Society of Petroleum Engineers Distinguished Lecture Series talking about how that should be done more safely. So here you have a fundamentally unsafe issue. It's like closing your eyes and walking across the street. You can do that. You may get away with it, but it's fundamentally unsafe. And at some point, the stars are going to line up against you and you're going to be hurt or killed. Now, how does that relate to flowback? We had a workover recompletion in Texas. This is a few years ago. We were flowing the well back through a very similar flowback vessel that we're talking about here today. And the vessel blew up. We had no idea why. No one was smoking. There was no flames on the site. And after our deep dive into what happened, we determined that in essence, what had happened was a flammable mix of air and gas had accumulated in the vessel, and that a static spark had set off. Fluid flows can create static buildup. It's just like sliding your foot across carpet. And so, unfortunately, we had just the right incident, right? All the stars lined up against us there, and the vessel blew up. Thank goodness no one was hurt. But it brings to mind the safety aspects of trying to flow back fluids safely to the surface. Now, Mr. Alexander talked in great detail about some of the steps that they took to mitigate that risk. I doubt that there's a lot of operators out there that understand it perhaps as deeply as they do. I know in my conversation with operators through my Distinguished Lecture Series and my conversations with providers of foam air, many people did not understand those risks properly. I suspect the same is occurring here. So when people tell me that this is incident-free in Colorado after those rules have only been put in place for a short time, I'm a little skeptical that that's really fundamentally safe. But let's also put that against that risk, against the volumes of gas that we're talking about. The OCD rules require operators to capture for sale gases as soon as a separator can physically operate. It's days, literally just days, maybe 2 or 3 days, maybe as much as 10 days before blowback occurs such that your separator can function. And then from then on, those gases are sold or flared. So the amount of gas that we're talking about during the initial flowback periods is really tiny. If the well was producing a lot more gas during the initial flowback period, then a separator could operate. So it really kind of self-correcting. If a well starts making a lot of gas, then the separator will work and you'll capture it. In essence, OCD has created a definition or requirement for a green completion. And that concludes my rebuttal. Mr. Heiser, I may have left something out. Could you remind me if I've done so?
So thank you, Mr. Smitherman, as I bounced my buttons the wrong direction and just disappeared. Is NMOGA recommending to the board that the EDF proposal be adopted?
No, we're recommending that they reject EDF's proposal.
And NMOGA's position basically is that the OCC has already really sort of pushed to the edge of what's technically and practically feasible and safe with their definition of when you need to put the separator in.
That's true. And I would also point out that the OCD really is the agency that has the most deep operational knowledge of oil and gas operations. That I compare them to the NMED staff. As wonderful as they are, as technically gifted as they are, It's just not the area that that they focus on. And so I would suggest that the OCD's and OCC's decision to not include this. By the way, this proposal was considered during the OCC hearing in January and was rejected. And I think that that speaks volumes.
Now, I believe that there was also some testimony that we heard about automatic tank measurement. Did you wish to touch on that as well?
Certainly. Let's split that into two phases, if you will. One, part of the proposal, part of EDS proposal on this completion and flowback was that those flowback tanks have automatic tank gauges. That really is unnecessary. If you don't close them, if you allow the small amounts of gases to escape and not have them under pressure, even small amount of pressures in these vessels, they really aren't necessary. They won't do anything for you. So it doesn't make any sense in that particular context. They have also recommended that automatic tank gauges be installed on regular production facilities during normal production operations. The OCD already has looked at this concept, and they are requiring that automatic tank gauging systems be required on all new facilities. That makes sense. Retrofitting an automatic tank gauging system can be expensive, can really be almost technically infeasible on some tanks. What that technology requires is that there be a connection, if you will, a place to hook up this device on the top of a tank. Some tanks have a connection that's available to use, but some tanks that were not designed for that just don't. And so those tanks, those existing tanks, would be extraordinarily expensive to modify, to retrofit. NMOGA supports the idea of requiring automatic tank gauging on new facilities. I think there's also some discussion of LACT units if that fits within this context too.
Okay, but we don't believe that it should be applied to modified units. And can you explain our concerns with the modification proposal?
Correct. Modified as defined, you can add a new tank to an existing facility, and that would be then a modified facility. That facility can still have older existing tanks that, again, may or may not have the capability of having an automatic tank gauging system added to them without extraordinary costs. So we really believe it's appropriate for new facilities, but it's not appropriate elsewhere.
And Mr. Smitherman, does NMOGA have some language changes that it would like to make to the automatic tank gauge or the automatic tank measurement provisions that have been suggested to sort of clarify these points?
Yes, we do. We've thought deeply about how to put this language in the rules so that it's effective, and it requires operators to utilize that technology when it's appropriate. And we've got that language for NMED to consider and the board to consider.
And looking at some of the language changes that you might like to see, we'd like to see allowance for 180 days. Is that correctly for certain of these changes to go into effect?
That's correct. There's, as we've talked about before, there's simply logistical supply chain issues that are involved, but also some locations you may actually have to do some contract modification if you're going to change the basis for any sales of crude oil. Those contracts may have to be modified in some cases, and we want to give operators sufficient time to address both of those two issues, physical and contractual.
Okay, and so then in section C1, you're thinking that maybe adding an allowance there for 180 days would be appropriate. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that this is also the same provision where we recommend to the Environmental Improvement Board to strike the language about facilities that are modified on or after the effective date for the reasons that you just explained.
That's correct.
And then in section C2, yesterday there was testimony from Dr. McCabe that the purpose of this provision to keep thief hatches closed was not to prevent our opening of the thief hatches or pressure relief devices for maintenance purposes. Do we think that that should be made clearer in section C2?
Yes, it seems much more restrictive than that. And I think that those are reasonable. There are reasonable times that those tank hatches must be opened for maintenance issues.
And then do we have just a couple of minor conforming changes to the language that we're going to recommend to the board and to the department?
Yes, we do.
About the time of the conclusion of your testimony.
Yes.
Thank you. Is there anything else there's a little bit of a strange reference in this first section where it talks about covering natural or compressor or transmission stations potentially because it uses the old term natural gas compressor stations. Do we believe it's necessary for transmission compressor stations to have automatic tank gauging, or are they sufficiently different?
They're sufficiently different. Their amounts of fluids that they get, the rates of accumulation of fluids there are so low that the addition, the cost of adding this equipment on those is not justified by the very, very small amounts of liquids that they deal with.
And transmission compressor stations aren't included in the scope of the Colorado rules. Is that correct for automatic tank gauging?
That's correct. I think I recall that. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Is there anything, Mr. Smitherman, that you would like to add to your testimony to this point with the board?
I guess the only thing that I would like to just mention is I took it from Mr. Alexander, and congratulations to Mr. Alexander and Southwest Energy for their thought, their forward thinking and their culture, if you will. But I want to make sure that the board understands that they're not unique. Our company, Bobco, is very proud of our work, and we worked very hard early on, for example, to reduce the amount of fresh water that was used in fracs. And we started 2013 with using produced water in fracs as an exception, and we ended that year with using fresh water as an exception. There are lots of companies out there that are forward thinking and don't just do what they did before. And I just want to make sure that that's well understood.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Smitherman. Madam Hearing Officer, that completes his testimony in this matter, and I would turn him over to the other parties for questions and the board as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smitherman and Mr. Heiser. Thank you for getting us to 12:14. I think this is a good time for a lunch break. I see some nodding heads among the board members. Let's come back at 1. We do have a number of public commenters at 1, and then we will return to Mr. Smitherman and questions of him. Thank you all.